All right, well, let's jump in. So welcome everyone to our first Best Practices Masterclass of the year. I'm thrilled to have you here. We've got some new faces and some folks that have been using Coachmetrix for a while. So thrilled to have you. And for folks who haven't been on our masterclasses before, our intent, well, we have a few intents really with the masterclasses. One is to help develop Coachmetrix knowledge, certainly. Another is to help sort of collectively grow our coaching businesses and our practices. And third, and maybe most important, it's to build some community. So we really want our coaches to get to know each other, to learn more about each other's business, to support each other, and even to find opportunities to work with each other. Ultimately, when you start using Coachmetrix, I think what you'll find is there's sort of like, in some ways, it provides some boundaries for the coaching process, sort of a connected way to coach, but still allows for the uniqueness of coaching that each individual coach brings. So it very easily starts to enable coaches to work together with a common methodology. So welcome to our Best Practices Masterclass. Today, we're going to focus on leveraging the Pulse feedback feature, which we think is a feature that really has the opportunity to set your business apart. So we're going to do a deep dive into that feature today. If you didn't get a chance to join us or to listen to the recorded session back in December, we focused on the customer value journey. It's a great way to think about your marketing process in a very simplified sort of one-page marketing plan. So as you're thinking about growing your coaching practice, take a listen to that masterclass. And the tool that we use is from a company called digitalmarketer.com. So today we're going to do a deep dive into the Coachmetrix Pulse feedback feature. And the feature itself, or at least our agenda for today, we're going to talk about why why Pulse feedback is important, some of the mechanics. We're going to get into some very detailed steps around how to use the feature, and then we'll share some best practices throughout the session today. And as a reminder, this is intended to be interactive, so feel free to jump in with questions. And once we dive in here, I'm going to actually ask you for your questions before we get started. We've got some master classes coming up February and March, so mark your calendar. Throughout all of the spring this year, we're going to focus on the technical aspects of Coachmetrix. So you might remember our master classes typically have one of three flavors. One is around the features and functionality of Coachmetrix. Sort of flavor number two is around building your coaching practice. So sharing ways in which we can build the business development in our coaching practice. And the third is sort of building expertise around coaching. But for the next quarter, we're really going to be focusing on the fundamentals of Coachmetrix. And part of why we're doing that is because we are thrilled to plant this seed. More information will be coming probably in the February timeframe, but Coachmetrix 2.0 is coming out soon this spring, probably in the April timeframe. And what you'll see with Coachmetrix 2.0 is an upgraded user interface. You'll see easier navigation. And then over the course of the spring, we're going to be releasing some significantly new features. So more to come. I just want to plant the seed and get you excited about it. I'm super excited as well. And part of what we are also interested in asking you all, if you're interested in being part of our beta testing team. And we sent out a subscriber survey. Thank you, Robin and Elise, for running that whole project. We got a ton of great information. One of the questions that we asked in that survey is, are you interested in being part of our beta testing group? And the beta testing group will have sort of early preview of some of the features. You won't be able to use those features with your existing clients, but you will be able to just get access to it, play around with it, give us some feedback. So if you're interested, please send an email to our support team, support@coachmetrix.com. All right. So many of you have heard this already. Where does Coachmetrix come from? Well, it comes from coaches. And part of what we heard early on from people is, in part of what we started observing in the marketplace, is that when action plans weren't online, when they were paper-based, people either didn't do them or they didn't do them to the extent that really drove behavioral change. So that was one of the core reasons why we created Coachmetrix. The second piece that we started to notice 2014, 2015 was that people like literally weren't coming to workshops with pens anymore. And we just started noticing in expectation that the services we were providing, the training, the workshops, the coaching had a digital component to it. And so part of what drove us was really being able to create a platform that allowed, in a very simplistic way, us to optimize our communication on engagements with clients and to optimize how we share things like resources and frameworks and tools. And the third piece and the most important piece was we really wanted to create a platform where we could measure behavioral change. And that's what continues to drive us at Coachmetrix, is to add more credibility to the coaching industry and to how we coach our clients. And what we always want to let you know is Coachmetrix is made by coaches for coaches, and we want to hear your feedback. We can't promise we're going to do everything that you'd like to see on the platform, but we do promise that we will listen. So thanks for sharing any feedback, good, bad, and different, what your user experience is. That always helps us think about the platform differently. All right, let's jump into Pulse feedback today. And there's a few things that we really just want to reinforce going into this. Why use Pulse feedback? Well, number one, we do think that the Pulse feedback feature itself is probably the one feature that differentiates Coachmetrix as a platform, and that will help differentiate you in your business. Many coaches do similar work. Most coaches don't actually measure whether leaders are changing. And that's what we are setting to change in the coaching industry. And so that's just number one. And part of that is that in the proposal process, what we continue to hear about many of our subscribers is that they win work because they can tell their prospective clients that they measure behavioral change, and they can help move that needle toward measuring return on investment. So number one, we think it sets your business apart. Number two, it helps keep your coachees accountable. Right? The Pulse feedback process gives really critical information to your coachees on how to change behavior, and it also enables them to change perception, both of which help create better behavioral change and more accountability in the coaching process. And then number three, it's a great way to extend your coaching engagement. So let's say you've got a 6-month leadership or executive coaching engagement. Oftentimes the Pulse feedback process will continue beyond the end of that engagement. It gives you a reason to follow back up with your clients, gives you a reason to stay in touch with your clients, gives you a reason to stay in touch with the executive sponsors who might be sponsoring those client engagements. So we just really want to set the tone that this is a really critical function and feature of Coachmetrix. Why not take advantage of it so that it helps move your business forward? All right, so let's talk about mechanics. And we're going to start from the very beginning with how to set up the Pulse feedback, how to create those action plans, and then some of the mechanics around establishing the Pulse feedback process. Before we get into that, though, I'd love to hear from you, which is, sorry, I'm not sure why this is happening. I use a tool called Beautiful instead of PowerPoint, and mostly because in many cases it's more beautiful than PowerPoint, easier to use, but they've released some features that have resulted in some just kind of wonky things with the mouse. All right, so in your chat box, would love to hear from you. What questions do you want answered about Pulse feedback? What's important to you about learning about this feature today? And take a moment to reflect on that and type that in your chat box. And Robin's going to kind of monitor some of the chats that are coming in. And as I move through this process today, I'll try to tailor what I speak about based on some of the questions that you have along the way in your chat box. All right, so let's first talk about the setup, because it's important to to just understand that there are some settings that you can establish at any point in time in the process on your engagement inside the settings function. So I want to show you where those are and talk about some of the implications of the settings. So this is Greg Smithy. Many of you have met Greg Smithy over the course of the last few years in our demo account. When I'm at the project level in Coachmetrix, so maybe I'll go all the way back to the beginning. Inside of Coachmetrix, you've got these boxes. Each box represents a project. A project could be a one-on-one coaching engagement with one person. It could be a one-on-one coaching engagement with several people. It could be a leadership development program, or it could be a team development program. When I click into my project, in the upper right-hand side, you're going to see this wheel icon. It says project settings if you scroll your mouse over it. And when you click on that, this is the page where you can adjust your pulse feedback settings. You can adjust the number of pulse feedback rounds. You can adjust the scale and the format, and whether people receive some reminders. So let me go through some of these settings really quickly. Number of pulse feedback rounds. This is a setting that you can change at any point in time. So let's say you default to 6 pulse feedback rounds on a 6 or 8 month coaching engagement, let's say. And then you get to the end of the engagement and your client says, you know, Sal, I'd really love to have more pulse feedback rounds beyond the end of the engagement. This is a setting that you can come back to and continue to adjust, okay? The feedback scale is also here. You can choose a traditional feedback scale, which comes in the form of it's like a traditional Likert scale, if you will. So a 1 to 5 or a 1 to 7, and you can display that when you get on your project page in either a line chart or a bar chart. The other format that we have is what we call a progress format. And so this is more of a traditional like stakeholder-centered coaching format, a negative scale to a positive scale where 0 represents no change. So negative numbers, the coachees getting worse, positive feedback that comes in, coachees getting better, and 0 represents no change. And so you can, once you select, this is really important, especially folks that are just starting out with pulse feedback. Once you select a pulse feedback scale and you begin the pulse feedback process, you cannot go back in and change the scale. So once that first round of pulse feedback goes out, you are locked in on that project with the scale that you choose. So you have to think about how you want to establish that scale. You can create we have 2 different privacy settings. The partially anonymous setting is the default setting. And what that does is it allows it allows you to see the comments that come in and the numerical scores that come in from your supporters, but it darkens out the supporter's avatar in an attempt to maintain anonymity. The other setting is the open setting. In some organizational cultures, and usually they're very mature cultures, very healthy cultures, clients are very open and supporters are very open to being open about their feedback. In other words, there is no anonymity to the feedback. And so at the beginning of your engagement, you can choose either the open setting or the partially anonymous setting. We default to this partially anonymous setting. And again, once the pulse feedback process has started, you cannot change this setting feature. The last setting to think about is to enable reminders. So when a pulse feedback round goes out, if you click enable reminders, it will send 3 additional reminders to both the participant as well as to the supporters to complete their pulse feedback if they haven't already completed. Okay, so those are the settings that I really wanted to share with you as part of today's conversation. Robin, did I miss anything or any implications around the settings that you can think of?
No, just maybe connect the dots with the anchoring. Did you touch on that?
Yeah, I didn't touch on it because that project had been set up already. So let's see. Okay. So on this project, let me show my screen again. This was a feature that we added last year. I think it was mid-year or in the fall. We added the ability to create some anchors so that there was a little bit more definition around the scale that you're using. And so as an example, when you choose the traditional format, you'll have a choice of choosing from any of these different behavioral anchors. The default for the old system, or what we offered before, was just when a supporter's looking at a scale, at one end of the scale there was a thumbs up, and at the other end of the scale there was a thumbs down. And now you can add some definition. So in some cases, it's a definition of frequency. And in other cases, it's a definition of whether you agree or disagree to the statement that we're surveying. Or in other cases, it's a definition of observation. So the connection that Robin's talking about is you will, depending on the scale that you choose, you will need to advise your participants to write their survey questions in alignment with the scale. So if you're asking them to write a survey item, and they're writing a survey item based on frequency of how often they see the behavior, but the statement is written around agreement or disagreement, there's going to be some misalignment between the behavioral statement that's written and the scale. So as the coach, you may need to guide your participants around how to write those behavioral statements. All right, so that's step one, get your project settings in place. Step two is to help your participant create their action plan. And in Coachmetrix, either you as the coach can create the action plan for your participant, or the participant can create their action plan. Now, our coaching philosophy is that the participant, they own their action plan, and therefore they should be creating it. Other coaches have different philosophies. So when we built Coachmetrix, we wanted to give you that option. Some coaches prefer to do the work for their coachee, meaning they've got a busy executive that they're coaching and they want to take that administrative burden off. Great, that's up to you. Just know that either you or the coachee have that ability to create the action plan. There's a few things that we think about from the action plan perspective. I'll talk through some of these and I'll show you them in Coachmetrix. Number one, the behavioral statement that I was just referring to, we recommend writing that behavioral statement in third person. So for example, if Doug McKinley on this call is my coachee, and Doug wants to be assessed on creating an open environment of communication, he would write his behavioral statement as Doug creates an open environment of communication, so that we're writing it from the perspective of the supporter who's taking the survey. The other piece with the action plan is you have the ability to share the action plan with anyone you choose. We often recommend that you share that action plan with the participant's manager, or that the participant shares the action plan with the manager. Partially because, and this is just more coaching philosophy than anything else, we don't want to get to the end of an engagement and say, great, Doug changed in all of these areas, but he focused on the wrong things. We want to uncover that early in the coaching process. There are some comments. So as a coach, you can make comments around the action plan. And then also as a best practice, we recommend creating some sample action plans as a resource, and then sharing that resource with your coachee so they can see the format with a specific example to go on. So if I go back to Coachmetrix, I'll go back to Greg Smithy's account. And I'm going to scroll down to one of Greg's goals. So here's Greg's behavioral statement. Greg encourages open dialogue during team meetings. You'll notice beneath the action plan, as the coach, I can make some comments about the action plan. So it's a great way to check in with your participants in between coaching sessions, or to provide some online guidance in a very efficient way. If you need to edit your goals, you can click and edit the goal. One caution statement, once the pulse feedback process has started, we definitely recommend you make updates to the body of your goal statement. As that pulse feedback data is coming in, we want to be adjusting the actions that we take based on the feed forward that people are providing us. But we highly recommend against changing your goal or your behavioral statement, because it will basically create a new data point on your pulse feedback chart. So okay to update the body of the action plan while keeping the goal and the behavioral statement consistent. Let's see if I missed anything. To calibrate your action plan or to share your action plan, once the action plan is built, you'll notice this button above each of the individual goals. When you click on that button, it will basically export the content of your action plan and send it to anyone you choose. Your coach, you can send it to yourself, you can send it to your supporters, or you can enter anyone else's email address and send it to your manager as an example. Brian, looks like you've got a question. What would be helpful for me to answer?
Yeah, on that idea of not that concept that if someone updates the behavioral thing, it shows up as a new data point.
Yes.
I'm curious. I had a client who went in and noticed a grammatical error, like an apostrophe S, and he changed it like in the middle of the process. And so now it reads the same, but there's, it's technically different. Is there any way to merge those, or is it just what it is and they're separate now? They don't show up aligned.
Yeah, they'll still, so the answer is there's no way to merge those.
Okay.
The old data will show up.
Right.
And the new data will show up.
Yeah,
so,
I see that. That's where I'm dealing with that. Yeah.
Yeah. So Greg's got 4 goals now. If you go in and change that apostrophe, it's basically going to add another data point that shows up in this information.
Yep. Okay.
In the metrics area.
That's what I've noticed. I didn't know if there was a workaround. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Now, part of the stakeholder-centered coaching methodology is that as that feedback's coming in, that pulse feedback data, right? If you click on the pulse feedback link, you'll see the same graph that you see on the homepage, but then you'll start to see these open-ended comments. We want to use that data. It's valuable data, right? It's framed as ideas and suggestions for the future. So if there's some good ideas in here, I would want to go back to the action plan, update my goal, and maybe focus on a new set of behaviors for February of 2022. You can see how old this data from 21. So the data is valuable. You can do an after action assessment in your coaching sessions, and you can help that coachee think about, okay, what are you going to focus on for the next 30 days?
Hey, Sal.
Yep.
Greg asked a question about, is the coach or coachee making the adjustments and goals to the action plan?
Great question. The answer is either, and it mostly depends on your coaching philosophy. For us, it's usually a conversation that we have with our coachee in a coaching session, and usually the coachee is making that change or that update. But for other people, it might be a conversation you're having in a coaching session, and once you've got agreement with your coachee and how that action plan should be updated, the coach could also make that change. Either way works.
And then Anjali asked just a little bit more broadly, what exactly can you measure? So maybe you can expand on, provide a few more examples of what would be in that goal and thus the behavior.
Yeah, so let me just open Greg's action plan. The way that we think about the action plan is we think about a high level statement here about what the leader wants to change. And we will typically ask that leader to connect it to a business result. So this probably isn't a very good example. So high level statement connected to the reason for the change or the potential impact of the change. And then we think about the behavioral statement as what would we notice about the leader if she was making that change? What's one behavior that could move the needle on the change? And then in the body of the action plan, this is just our philosophy. There's probably 100 ways to do this. We tend to think about bullet points that are more action oriented and highly measurable, like more in the SMART format. So what are the 3 things that I'm going to take some action on? So oftentimes it's helpful to leverage your 360. If you're doing some 360 or personality style profile or some kind of assessment at the beginning of your engagement, oftentimes there are competencies or there's data points in there that you can leverage to write either your behavioral statement or your goal statement. So for example, we often use the leadership circle 360 in our coaching, and I'm going to get this number wrong, but there's probably, 12 or 15 different competencies on the upper part of the circle, and then some reactive tendencies in the bottom part of the circle. Grab one of those competencies and leverage the data that's in that 360 so you have a consistent action plan based on the source of the data that's providing insight for that action plan. Is that helpful, Anjali, or any other questions around that topic?
Yeah, that's super helpful. And apologies in advance because I'm just starting out. But my question is there, I understand that the pulse feedback is for the supporters. And is there any part of measurement that's self-reported by the coachee?
Yes, absolutely. Let's go to that process right now.
Okay, thank you.
So once we've got the action plan, once we've got our settings set up and we've got our action plans in place, we're going to set up our supporters. Our supporters will be taking the assessment, and the same exact survey also goes out to the participants. So there's a self-assessment and a supporter assessment. So we're really heading on that level 2 behavior change, or that level 2 measurement, as well as level 3 measurement, which is from the perspective of other people. Let me talk through the supporter setup. Number 1, a couple of themes here, because some of this isn't so obvious in Coachmetrix. You can have different supporters for different goals. And so if I just go back to Greg Smithy, Greg, if I go back to Greg, he has 4 different supporters. So it's very simple to add a supporter. You're just going to click on this add plus button and you add their supporter name and the email address. If you have more than 7 supporters, that's okay. You just have to go through and click that add supporter button again. It'll give you another list of 7 open-ended spaces to add their names. You can include a welcome message if you choose to, and then you'll click the add supporter button. Now, when you add your supporters, all of your supporters will be added to all of the goals that Greg has. Now, some supporters, you may not want to respond to some of your goals because maybe they can't observe Greg doing that, or maybe they're just not impacted by that leadership behavior. So when I go into this goal, I can edit the goal, and then I can remove, you can see in this case, we've removed 3 people from the goal. So they're not going to get that pulse feedback survey. So you can have different supporters for different goals. We tend to think in terms of who is impacted by this leader's behavior, and those should be people who would be your supporter. Does that make sense in terms of adding supporters? Okay, awesome. A few best practices, because this is really important. In the truest sort of stakeholder-centered coaching methodology, it's important to go public with your action plan. So we don't want our participants to just add supporters to Coachmetrix without first telling and enrolling their supporters about what they're working on. If we truly want to change perception change and behavior change, we have to do 3 things. Number 1, get clear on what you're working on. Number 2, tell people about what you're working on. And then number 3, follow up with them, right? If you don't do the follow-up, you're not going to change perception, at least based on the data that Marshall Goldsmith has come up and written about in Leadership as a Contact Sport. So we highly recommend that before you add a supporter into Coachmetrix and click that button that sends out the welcome message to that supporter, that you have your participants have a conversation with their supporters and say, hey, I am in this leadership development program or coaching program. I'm working on these 3 things. would you be willing to support me throughout the process by responding to some pulse survey feedback and then allowing me to connect with you over time to get your feedback as well? It's a very simple conversation, and that can be done between the participant and the supporter directly. Sometimes the coach is involved in that conversation too. Both are really good methodologies. So
And, really
Yep.
quickly, I just want to reinforce that and make sure we had a bunch of questions about how do we ensure that we have full supporter engagement. So it really, I guess, just to reinforce what Sal's saying, it starts at the very beginning in the selection, and those initial conversations are so significant to make sure you set the expectation and you make sure that those supporters are willing.
yeah, exactly. There's sort of two criteria. One, we're selecting people that are impacted by the leader's behavior. And then also we're selecting people who are willing to go on this leadership journey with the leader, with the participant. And by the way, there's a great ripple effect when this is really implemented well, because now these supporters are watching that leader change and they tend to want to change as well. So to Robin's other point, it's not just connecting the participant and the supporter at the beginning of the engagement, but also throughout the engagement. So we want that participant to go back to their supporters every 30 days, every 45 days, and say, hey, I've been working on creating an environment of open communication. How have I done? What's your recommendations for the future? That follow-up will help create behavior change. And you can look at the methodology in Marshall's Harvard Business Review article, Leadership as a Contact Sport. When leaders don't follow up with people who are impacted by their behaviors, it's unlikely that perception of them will change, right? That's really key here. I can go and change a behavior today. It's unlikely people will see it if I'm not following up with them. Brian, question.
Yeah, I was one of the folks who asked that question about increasing engagement of supporters, and I noticed there were several that did as well. Just maybe to extend on that, I do encourage people to have those conversations. I'm asking, are you having those? Did you have those? Don't just send an email, have a phone call or whatever. I was just curious if there were any sort of miscellaneous little tips or unique things besides asking people to do it and reminding them to do it. If there's not, but I just thought I would ask.
Yeah, one tip is create a resource that basically scripts out how that participant should have the conversation. That's what we do. So then I can send that resource to the participant and they've got the process. And it's a very simple process. It's almost exactly what I said. Hey, I've been working on X. How have I done? What are your recommendations for the future? Thank you. And I'll follow up with you again in 30 days. But if you just give that framework to your participant, it will enable them to have the conversation. So that's one tip, Brian, that we've used in the past. And then the other tip I think is exactly what you're doing, which is confirming in each of your coaching sessions, have you had this conversation with your people or with your supporters?
You know, my supporters, Brian, are saying they're not getting the emails. They're not, it's going into spam or whatever. I'm actually sending them your video, Sal.
Yeah.
I'm sending them an article about what a supporter means. And then they're saying they're not getting them. I'm like, I know you're getting them because I see it go out. So
Yeah.
how are you overcoming the spam or filters stuff?
Yeah, it's a great question. In some organizations, there are some issues with spam, and we have. You may have already seen this. I think it's in our knowledge base, and I'm looking for it right now as we're speaking. But in our knowledge base, there is some safe listing information that you may need to give to that client's tech IT group. And then once that happens, there shouldn't be any issues around spam.
What's that section under? What's that called?
I'll
It's a
send
good
a
question.
link to it. I'll send a
Okay.
link, I'll put it in the chat.
That'd be
Awesome.
great. Thank you. That's perfect.
And it's in our knowledge base in the upper
Got it.
right, Doug, and Robin will send that link. Great question. Thank you for asking that.
You know what, Doug, that actually reminds me of something I do when I set up the leadership circle. I'm going to start doing this now. At the
Yes.
beginning, I actually ask the coachee to confirm that everyone received the invite. I
Right.
don't do that with this pulse, and I just now got that idea that I need to do that. Just so for that first round, at least I know that first one's going through. I just thought I would share it with the group in case it was helpful for anybody else.
That's great.
I even offer to chat with this I call them stakeholders,
Yep.
but they're often shy. They feel like they're telling on their boss or their teammates. So it's been very frustrating to get engagement with them.
Yeah. I think the way to do it, Doug, is include the manager, the person that you're coaching, in those conversations, and have the manager set up the meetings as opposed to you, because what we don't want to do is create triangulation. So let's say you have a supporter or stakeholder meeting to enroll them.
Right.
The manager should be there, the stakeholders there, and you as well.
Yeah.
Let's-
Actually, another idea is I might just have supporter meetings. I've done it before where I brought them all into a room. Now we could do it virtually. So
Yeah,
maybe we'll just have a
absolutely.
supporter meeting. That's a
Absolutely.
good idea.
Brian, and I love your idea, Brian, of adding this into, like, similar to the leadership circle or any 360. Typically that participant is going to send an email to all of their raters to say, hey, I'm in this leadership program. Will you rate me? By the way, keep an eye out for a survey link from the leadership circle in your case. You can create that same letter, build it as a resource, give it to your coachee, and then they can send it out to their supporters.
Yep, I like that too.
Let's talk about the mechanisms of the pulse feedback process itself. And I'm just going to step through it. So once the action plan's in place, supporters are in the system, now we're ready to send out pulse feedback. To do that, you're going to click on the pulse feedback link under your participant's name. And you have two options as a coach. You can either automate the pulse feedback process where you're setting it and forgetting it, or either the coach or the participant can send out what we call an immediate pulse feedback request. Let me go to the automated piece first. When you click on this button, basically you have your settings. You can enable the automatic pulse feedback requests by clicking on this button here, and then you can set the frequency. In other words, how often do you want the pulse feedback surveys to go out? This number can be anything. We have landed on about every 45 days. That seems to be the sweet spot, but it's really up to your methodology. You could send it out every 30 days or every 180 days. You choose the frequency, and you're just going to change that number here. You set the date of the first, when you want that first pulse feedback round to go out. And once you click Save Preferences, that round of pulse feedback will go out. Over time, you'll be able to see the pulse feedback history. So you can see when each round went out previously. You can also see the project settings that you've selected. So in this project, they've selected 5 rounds. They're using a progress scale of -2 to +2. Their privacy setting is partially anonymous, and the reminders are on. If you want to go and adjust these settings, there's a quick link right here to the project dashboard to adjust those settings. And then a frequent question that we get is, what do these pulse survey emails look like? Or what do the surveys look like? So we put this quick link here so that you could always see what the surveys look like. And when you click on that, it'll take you to the survey page so that you have clarity on what those supporters are responding to. Okay, so you'll see the scale. In this case, they're not using an anchor, just the thumbs up, thumbs down. You can see how the open-ended question or statement is framed, and it just gives you clarity. So that's how you create your pulse feedback settings. It's very simple. You're just going to add the frequency in here. You're going to put the first round of the first pulse feedback and then save those preferences.
Hey, Sal.
Yep.
Sorry, there was a question about the email that goes out and whether or not that can be modified.
Great question. Right now, that email cannot be modified.
Those are
And
standardized emails.
yeah, they're standardized emails. It has the supporter's name in the email so that they know it's legitimate. It has a standard question like, hey, Doug McKinley's looking for your pulse feedback. And then it's signed by Robin. If I'm not mistaken, that email is actually at the bottom of the email, it's the participant's name.
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah. All right. The other
one more question.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Doug
No, no
asked
problem at all.
how often really send them out. So again, Doug, is that the frequency that you're asking about? What's a realistic?
So if I just go back to this page, Doug.
I'm doing monthly. Is that what we should do? Maybe that's why people aren't responding. I just think monthly is needed, but yeah.
Yeah,
what's needed?
I would say experiment, Doug. We used to do monthly. We used to do every 30 days. We found that we were just getting some survey fatigue. And so people we started seeing a pretty significant drop off of supporter enrollment. So we shifted to every 45 days. And that's what we've been doing now for several years. That seems to be working really well.
Okay.
We don't get 100% supporter engagement. And there's a very strong correlation between enrolling that supporter verbally and then regular follow-ups between the supporter and the participant. But we get much better engagement numbers on a every 45-day basis.
That's helpful. Thank you.
All right. So if you've got a 6-month coaching engagement, we might not even start the pulse feedback process till like 3 months into the engagement. And that's okay because it extends that engagement, gives me a reason as the coach to follow up with participants, and it gives me a reason as a coach to stay in touch with my executive sponsors.
Okay.
So just so you know, folks, it's 11:45 Mountain Time. We're scheduled to end now. I'm going to keep going. Feel free to drop off. This is all recorded, but I want to make sure we get through all of the pulse feedback process. There's a couple other things to go over. You can also request immediate pulse feedback. Now, when we built this feature, our intent at the time was if I'm Greg and I'm working on creating open dialogue during team meetings, I might have a meeting with my leadership team and say, okay, I want to see how people are responding to that. So Greg or the coach has access to this feature. I can click on this button. It tells me what round of pulse feedback we're in. I can choose the supporters that were in that meeting and then send that round of pulse feedback out immediately. It sends the pulse feedback out to all of the goals that are on Greg's list, but it's more of that immediate response that we're looking for here. I would say most people don't use this feature. There probably are some improvements that we need to make to it, but I just want to show you and let you know that that feature is there and that it exists. All right, the final comment or the final step, and maybe I'll just review the steps. Get your settings set up. Number 2, get your action plan in place. Number 3, add your supporters. Number 4, start that pulse feedback. And then number 5, it's really about integrating the data that's coming in from that pulse feedback into your coaching. So I've already talked about this really, but it's looking at those feed forward comments, it's looking at the numbers, and then going back into the body of that action plan and making adjustments so that the leader is adjusting real time as that data comes in over a period of time. Again, in most programs, there's a 360 at the beginning. Maybe there's a time to at the end, completely unfocused. We want to leverage the data that's coming in throughout the engagement to help that coachee make some real-time changes. A few final just best practice reminders. I think I've probably hit these already. Align your scale to your anchor, right? So if you've got an anchor that's based on frequency, make sure that your coachees are writing their behavioral statements based on frequency. Number 2, the conversation matters the most, right? So the coaching conversation, the conversation between the participant and their supporters, both at the enrollment stage and then following up every 30 days. And then finally, leverage the ability to create resources and collections. So inside of your Coachmetrix platform, we put some resources in there and some collections. They're mostly to give you some ideas on how to use those features, but you can leverage some of the things that we put in there. We put in a collection on how to create an action plan. Very, very simple feature or very simple resource. I'm sorry for my screen scrolling so much, but create your action plan. Feel free to use this, delete it, or change it to make it more effective. So there's some instructions here. There's a step on how to create a SMART goal. There's a step on how to create a behavior, characteristics of a good behavior, and then some examples. And then there's step 3 on what the action items would look like, so that the entire goal is, there's an example here, a goal statement, a behavior statement, and then action items, and then what support is needed. But feel free to either modify that or create your own, so that people have a resource on what does a good action plan look like. You know, I'm blown away as we've had a chance now to look at thousands of action plans. I'm amazed at how poorly participants write action plans. It's unbelievable. And I'm talking about like senior and executive leaders.
Agree.
So it's mind-boggling, and people often feel offended when you teach them about SMART goals, but it's amazing how infrequently people write really good goals and can create an action plan. So they need your help. You might as well create a resource in Coachmetrix to help them do that. Create that resource to give them a script on how to enroll supporters, and create a resource to give people a script on how to follow up with their supporters each month. So let me open it up for questions, either questions that were in the chat box or any other questions that you might have. I think once you get these processes down, you'll have the bulk of how to really use the best features of Coachmetrix and I think set your engagements apart.
Sal, this is June. Just
Yes, June.
a quick question because I had to jump off. So the piece in terms of align the scale and anchor, can you recap that just very quickly visually so I can see what you were referring to?
Yeah, for sure, June. Let me, I'm just going to pull up the project settings. Again, if I go back to this project, inside the project settings, sorry, let me go to a different project.
Okay, gotcha.
This was an old project.
Graham.
So inside when you are in your settings, you have the ability to, if I choose a 1 to 7 scale as an example, I have 3 different anchors that I can choose from.
Okay.
No
gotcha.
anchor, an agreement anchor, so strongly agree, disagree, neutral, somewhat agree, or a frequency scale. I don't ever see this person doing that, or I almost always see this person doing that. So we're simply saying we just have to make sure that the behavioral statements or the survey items that we're measuring are in alignment with the scale that we're using. Do you agree with what you're seeing, or is it a frequency statement? Does that make sense, June?
Yes. I'm probably gonna have to revisit that. Yes.
Okay. And I'm trying to think if I can think of an example. So if I have an agreement statement, it might be something like June creates an open environment of communication. Probably either of these formats would work with that particular statement. Strongly disagree, strongly, somewhat agree, or somewhat agree, or strongly agree. So that would work. I'm trying to think of an example that's more frequency based versus agreement based.
Sal is an
Now,
Sal is an effective trainer.
Thank you for that. That's a statement of agreement. I highly agree with that, or I strongly disagree. But frequency probably doesn't work as well with that behavioral statement.
Right.
Okay.
Thanks for that. Thanks for helping me out there, Doug. I appreciate that.
I'm glad you didn't ask me for the answer, but I'd say strongly agree.
Okay, good. Thank you. I appreciate that too.
And is there a preference 1 to 7 versus 1 to 5 or 1 to 3? I mean,
Um,
and there's
it's
options.
up,
but-
yeah, it's really up to your methodology. Oftentimes we suggest that you align the scale with your 360 profile. So that could be an idea.
Okay,
We don't necessarily do that. For example, we use the leadership circle, which is on a scale of 1 to 5, but then we use the progress format, which is negative to positive. So once a leader gets clear in what they're working on, we measure based on, are they getting better or are they getting worse?
okay. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I have
Awesome.
a
Rob,
question, so.
yes, Brian, go ahead.
So on the, so when it comes to the action plans where we're adding goals and behaviors and the notes, I've found frequently that we're wanting to measure a couple different behaviors, but the goal is really the same.
Yeah.
And it feels redundant when the idea of potentially sharing that action plan sort of feels like, what am I looking at here? Is there any opportunity or any intention in the future maybe to have multiple behaviors under one goal or that sort of thing?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Yes, there is. That's on our radar. There's so many things on our radar, but that's a action plan improvement that we do want to make. We've heard that pretty consistently. So what Brian's saying is, if you have a goal in the system, we can only have one behavior that's attached to that goal. And that's what we're measuring. And in the future, we would see having the ability to have maybe multiple behaviors attached to that goal. The workaround right now, and this is the redundant piece, is creating an identical goal, but with a different behavior. So to the supporter, they won't know the difference. But if you're sharing out the entire action plan, people are going to see the same exact goal in that action plan, but with different behavioral statements. So there's the workaround now is having the same goal twice, but with a different behavioral statement. And we do expect that in the future, we'll make that change. Thanks for that feedback, Brian. Awesome. Any other questions for today before we wrap up? All right. Well, thanks everyone
What's the
for
topic for
joining.
next month?
Yeah.
What's the topic for next month?
Honestly, we don't know, but but what we do know, what's that? What do we know, Robin?
We do know.
Thank you.
It's,
Robin's there to keep me straight.
It's onboarding.
Oh, right. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So that's a big one too, right? We want to onboard our clients effectively. I'll give you one quick tip. Assumptively use Coachmetrix and everyone uses it. If you give people a choice, right, most people won't use it, right? Just like with any new technology. So, but if you assumptively say, this is how we coach, and part of we call it a leadership accountability portal or a leadership accountability hub. You get to go to one place for everything related to your coaching, your leadership development platform. Then everyone uses it. It's almost as simple as that. But we do have some tips and best practices for onboarding your clients. So we'll cover those in February. My guess is in March, we're going to show you an early preview of what Coachmetrix 2.0 is going to look like. And we'll be thrilled about that. And then April, May, June will be all about Coachmetrix 2.0. I think the transition is going to be easy. The functionality is the same with some new features. But there will be some nuances of how to do things that will be slightly different. Anjali.
Is this available on a mobile platform? And if so, what percentage of supporters use that?
Yeah, so the platform itself is mobile optimized. So
Okay.
you can easily use it on your iPad or your tablet or your phone. We don't have an app for it. So, and then I don't have the data on who's doing what for in what format. What I will show you is that there's an ability to create an icon on your iPhone. You probably can't see this, but I have a little Coachmetrix arrow that sits right here. So I do quite a bit of work on Coachmetrix from either my mobile device or certainly from my iPad. My guess is a lot of people do as well.
And if you're able to create an icon like that, it's almost just as good as an app.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the really interesting thing since COVID is with so many people working virtually and remotely, there's actually been a shift back from apps to websites. So since people are sitting at their desktops or their laptops so much more often than maybe they were doing before.
Right.
Anjali,
Thank you.
I just sent we have an article on creating that shortcut that it would be great for you to use, but also share with your participants. If they get that going, they can click on that really easily from their mobile device and be fully functional. It works really well.
Great question.
Perfect.
right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Hope you have a great weekend. Feel free to reach out if you've got any questions, and we'll see you in February for our next Best Practices Masterclass. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.